So in this episode, we're going to finish modelling out the front part of the helmet that we started modelling in the last episode. And right away, we're going to extrude out this vertice, and this is going to be rather important as it's going to be the basis for where we split the mesh off and we start to model in the mouthpiece. Now, I know that this actually isn't in line with anything at the moment, but I've extruded that down in such a way so that it's roughly in line with the edge above it. So that's a nice straight line from the very top vertice to the middle vertice to that one down at the end there. We are going to adjust it so it does eventually line up with the reference image where we have that little cut just before the triangular piece. But for the time being, we'll just keep it nice and straight, and we can add more geometry in later on, and then we can start to refine the shapes from there. Once again, I'm just going to leave you guys to watch the video play out, and I'll chime back in as we start to separate the mesh off and begin the modeling process for the mouthpiece. With most of the retopology of this section done, we're just going to go ahead and dissolve with this final edge. This allows us to have nice edge flow around the outer limits of our model. Once we do some spacing operations on these edges and vertices here, we're going to go around and select this new little loop that we have on the edge of the model, and we're going to mark these edges as sharp. Once again, this is to keep track of an important detail, and we are also going to be duplicating all those faces contained within that marked sharp and start to extrude those out as a separate mesh to begin the modeling of our mouthpiece. I make a duplicate of the mesh right here, and this mesh that we're editing right now is the one that we're going to continue modeling on. Although I made a duplicate of it as I thought initially I was going to be using shrink wrap modifiers to do the entire helmet, which wasn't the case. Although keeping a duplicate of your mesh before you do something major, such as we're about to do, isn't actually bad practice. I typically do this when I am going to model a new major detail and keep a duplicate of the previous version in case something goes wrong. This is also particularly useful when doing booleans, as sometimes boolean operations go wrong and it's easy to revert back to a previous state. Now, don't apply the Solidify modifier such as I've just done, because we're not quite done with it yet. We especially don't want it to be filling in those back faces there. The reason we're using a Solidify modifier, much like when we were doing the visor brim, is that it reduces the workload we need to do for making this extrusion and allows us to more precisely refine where this extrusion is going. Now, we're only interested in these selected faces, so we can invert the selection and delete those unnecessary faces. We're doing the mouthpiece as a separate model for the time being. It will be connected back with the rest of the geometry at the end, but we are doing this to avoid destroying the nice hard edges that we've created on our geometry already. Should we make any modifications to the vertices that are still touching the helmet, it's not going to destroy the nice curvature that we've added to the front of the helmet, nor is it going to destroy the nice lines that we've defined around where the mouthpiece will be positioned. Extruding these edges out here just allows us to understand the bounds of where the mouthpiece is going to exist in relation to the rest of our geometry. You'll notice here as I pull these forward, I actually work in sort of an offset nature to that of our reference image, and that's purely because I didn't fully understand how accurate my reference images were at the time. We do later fix this up and we adjust everything and bring it forward a little bit more, but for the time being, if you follow along with what I've done and have it offset from the front of the reference, that's okay because we will fix it up later on. We're just going to bring in a plane here, cut it right down the middle and delete the left-hand side, allowing us to only have to do 50% of the work. The reason we're bringing in a plane is that it's going to be responsible for modeling the front section of the mouthpiece. Personally, I just found it easier to model with separate objects for this and then to connect all of them back together at the end. The reason I've done this is you work on a couple of odd angles throughout this, and they're rather odd because you need to keep everything nice and consistent with one another, but you also have a nice rectangular shape at the front surrounded by two triangles that then leads into two parts of a curved surface on the other sides of it. So it's all rather complicated, and personally I just found it easier to work in separate meshes as opposed to having all this geometry and all the topology depending on one another at the same time. I found it easier to do it individually, and then we could retopologize it all at the end. You'll notice as I've dragged this forward, I've tried to have the plane align in the center of the front line of the reference image there, and I'm using the Y and Z axis arrows to determine where the center point is. This just means as I rotate it, it'll rotate from the center and I can get a nice alignment with the reference image. Just to clarify where I'm trying to position this edge at the moment, I'm trying to position it in such a way so that when I do an edge slide, it'll slide along that edge that we have a sharp marked on. So I'll bring it out again in just a second, and you'll notice as I do an edge slide, the edge slide roughly moves along the exact same angle as that sharply marked line. You'll notice inadvertently from doing that, it's actually made a nice triangular shape in our mesh. There's nothing existing there yet, but it gives a nice block out for where that triangle is going to later exist. And that's why I've decided to develop this method of working in a whole lot of separate meshes and then later building on everything else. As you'll see, it kind of forms itself as we put all the pieces together. We're about to do an edge slide here, and what I want to achieve is that with that first vertice we selected, we want to do the edge slide just until it disappears into our other mesh. That just means that it's roughly aligned with the other part of the mesh, and then as we go through to start to create the triangle, it'll all be nicely aligned. This is the same reason that we deleted the previous versions of the geometry that we're editing right now, as if we tried to do an edge slide with these still existing, then the edge slide would have been all askew and all over the shot. We probably could have gone ahead and either hidden them or just separated them from the geometry for the time being, although there's no harm in deleting them and then just doing it again anyway, because sometimes you actually get a better perspective on where everything should be positioned. The modifications I'm making to the geometry right now are just in preparation for putting in the triangular details later on. So you'll notice the top edge at the moment is roughly aligned with where the bottom of the triangles are going to exist. It's not exact, but it's close enough and it will work for what we need later on. The edge slide we're about to do with this vertice, all we want to do is have it line up with the cut that we've just put in, as we are in a moment going to add additional geometry to the front of the mouthpiece and start to connect everything up. With the modifications we've done and the positioning of our vertices, we can now go ahead and select this triangular cutout, duplicate it, and we can separate it from the rest of the geometry. Once again, as I said, it's a lot easier to work in separate entities of geometry as opposed to all at once, and then we can make refinements to the positioning of all the vertices later on. We just want to go ahead and dissolve these three edges here, as I just want to make a modification to the bottom positioning of the triangle. Now remember, we generally go through and dissolve things like this when we want to make a change to some of the geometry but keep a nice straight line in our modifications. You'll notice after we move it, we add the edges back in and we keep a nice straight line. Were we to keep all three of those edges across the triangle, that movement we've just made would have required us to make 2 or 3 additional changes to the triangle. Just to clarify, what I'm doing here is I'm trying to make the bottom edge of the triangle align with that sharp edge just beneath it. It doesn't need to be exact, as we'll merge some vertices later on, but that's roughly where I'm trying to line it up with for the time being. The edge slide that we're doing right here, all you're looking for is to just have that edge disappear behind the mouthpiece. Once we have that, we'll have a point of intersection between the two meshes, and later on we'll be able to add in additional edge cuts and join the two things together. The modification we're making to the geometry right now is going to later be responsible for the inset behind that little trapezium piece that we cut out in the front of the mouthpiece. So we're once again almost at the end of another tutorial. You'll notice, however, that I've run into a bit of a problem here. There's this weird gap between the front of the mouthpiece, the bottom, and that triangular detail. I don't quite figure it out by the end of this tutorial, but straight away at the start of the next tutorial, I will show you how to fix it. I just wanted to give you guys a break, as this has been going on for a little while now, and I don't want to burn you out. So on that note, we will go ahead and fix this problem in the next episode, and I will see you guys in the next one.